reading this morning is an excerpt from Katherine May's 2020 book entitled Wintering, the Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. She writes, I'm beginning to think that unhappiness is one of the simple things in life, a pure, basic emotion to be respected, if not savored. I would never dream of suggesting that we should wallow in misery or shrink from doing everything we can to alleviate it. But I do think it's instructive. After all, unhappiness has a function. It tells us that something is going wrong. If we don't allow ourselves a fundamental honesty of our own sadness, then we miss an important cue to adapt. We seem to be living in an age when we're bombarded with entreaties to be happy, but we're suffering from an avalanche of depression. We're urged to stop sweating the small stuff, yet we're chronically anxious. I often wonder if these are just normal feelings that become monstrous when they're denied. A great deal of life will always stink. There will be moments when we're riding high and moments when we can't bear to get out of bed. Both are normal. Both, in fact, require a little perspective. Sometimes the best response to our howls of anguish is the honest one. We need friends who wince along with our pain, who tolerate our gloom, and who allow us to be weak for a while when we're finding our feet again. We need people who acknowledge that we can't always hang on, that sometimes everything breaks. Short of that, we need to perform those functions for ourselves. To give ourselves a break when we need it, and to be kind. To find our own grit in our own time. Katherine May writes that unhappiness is instructive, an alarm bell of sorts, alerting us that something has gone amiss. She suggests that this basic emotion is one to be not only respected, but perhaps even savored. I don't know how that makes you feel, but I must admit that the first time I considered the invitation to lean in and embrace my despair, I felt myself recoil. This simple idea goes against so much of what we learn in our culture today. We hear we must persist, turn the other cheek, find the joy, constantly be improving. Good vibes only, all the time. But what if that's not entirely true? Because of course it's not. Katherine May's message is delivered beautifully through all of her writing, and this book is a hauntingly soothing listen if you enjoy audiobooks. But her wisdom, though it's still counterculture, is not uniquely held. Dr. Mark Brackett, who is a professor at Yale and founder and director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, actually shares a similar message, but it's a little bit more widely applicable. In his 2019 book called Permission to Feel, Brackett argues that we would all be better off, individually and collectively, if we could each learn to be emotion scientists. He explains that our feelings are the products of our brains processing and analyzing all of the news they receive from our senses. And this information, of course, comes from our bodies, our minds, and the environment around us. Many years of scientific research into emotional intelligence have resulted in understanding that our feelings most certainly impact our cognition and our behavior. That in and itself doesn't really feel like a surprise. But the research goes further and shows 5 distinct aspects of life that are most directly impacted by our emotions, how we're feeling. Our ability to pay attention and to learn, our capacity to make decisions, our social relationships, our physical health, and our creativity, effectiveness, and productivity. That list encompasses pretty much everything that matters. I'm going to say it again. Our ability to pay attention and learn, capacity to make decisions, social relationships, physical health, and creativity, effectiveness, and productivity. It's a lot. So Dr. Brackett and his team developed this tool, which of course then they made into an app, and it's a thing if you need to think about feeling all the time. But it helps us label and recognize our emotions, which seem silly at first, and then you do it, and it's pretty amazing. What they did is they have plotted all conceivable emotions, everything you can imagine, on a graph. And that graph, this doesn't really matter, but if you need a visual, basic cue. The graph measures pleasantness against energy levels. So the 4 quadrants and the emotions each get a color. So red feelings have low pleasantness, right? They're bad, but lots of energy. So this is like rage and restlessness. Yellow, lots of energy, lots of pleasantness. You might feel blissful, motivated. Get where we're going here? Green is that low energy, but high pleasantness, complacency, feeling carefree might come to mind. And of course, blue. Blue is where we have low energy and low pleasantness. Maybe disgust, despondency. And this graphic representation provides a fascinating view of the depth and breadth of all of our emotions. It's also really accessible, and I bet some of the young people here may have even learned in school to think about what color they are feeling. I've heard kids say, it was a yellow day. Feeling blue, we're a little bit more familiar with. Not surprisingly, this blue zone is where wintering can be most relevant. According to Katherine May, every one of us will experience a period of personal winter, and some of us will experience many. As she describes it, quote, "Wintering is a season in the cold. It is a fallow period in life when you're cut off from the world, feeling rejected, sidelined, blocked from progress, or cast into the role of an outsider." End quote. The reasons for this vary as much as the winters do themselves. Illness, bereavement, the end of the relationship, or the birth of a child. A sudden major transition in your personal or professional life, or perhaps some more gradual changes in caregiving responsibilities, loss of identity, or just unexplainable depression. May warns that however it arrives, wintering is usually involuntary, lonely, and deeply painful. Yet, it is also inevitable. Of course it is. It's lovely to envision a world or a life in which only the good times roll. But we know that death, sadness, hardship, and injustice all exist. Suffering is a significant part of life. Buddhism is both delightfully simple in its general message and incredibly complex in how one tries to fully incorporate its wisdom into being. In the most basic terms, Buddhists believe that suffering is far less about what we experience and mostly focused on how we react to those experiences. When we can learn the art of detachment from what happens to us, we can become free of the impacts of suffering. Perhaps this is the role a personal winter can fill. Our own wintering can help us to detach from our suffering and to live into our emotions. In terms of the mood meter, I interpret wintering to be a process of experiencing that blue state and over time shifting from blue to green, perhaps emerging then into yellow, a personal springtime of rebirth and renewal. I can recall several of my own winters. You probably can too. In college and early adulthood, I dealt with autoimmune disease and was often sidelined by waves of intense pain and debilitating exhaustion, lasting days or even weeks. And I managed some of those winters better than others. Looking back, I suspect that it was those bouts of illness that I was more able to just submit to because they didn't happen during final exams or when I had an infant and a full-time job to juggle, that passed more smoothly. There were far too many winters I fought so hard to stop, despite literally feeling them creeping in through my bones. It's critical to dispel some misconceptions about wintering, too. Wintering is about acceptance, but it is not about giving up. Instead, it's a retreat. We conserve our energy to best approach what we cannot avoid. Think about the story we heard earlier about the abscission of leaves in the late fall. The trees have a plan. They know what they must do as signs of winter appear. And if you take a moment today to look closely at a tree that has lost its leaves, you'll notice something remarkable. Those buds that will burst open in spring are already there. Most trees produce their buds in the peak of summer, when their energy production is at its height. We don't actually notice those buds until the leaves fall, if we notice them at all before May, but they are ready. So how can we take a lesson from the trees? Surely here in New England we know a bit about winter preparation. We see it coming on the calendar in those shorter days, and we have our furnaces serviced. We find the snow shovels and the ice scrapers and take out our favorite sweaters. Everybody has their preparation process. And in the poem we heard to open worship, Barbara Kingsolver shared musings about another winter preparation, curing of sweet potatoes. Whether you're a gardener or not, you may have recognized that it takes all kinds of energy to turn something starchy into something sweet. And yes, it can be done. But Kingsolver gently asks us to consider the times when we too were forced to thicken our skins, to be something we weren't, to meet others' demands. She even aptly names this as surrender, before closing with the mild suggestion that we consider the direction of our grace. What happens if we direct our grace towards ourselves as our own inevitable winters approach? Can we prepare for those periods of rest and retreat in our most difficult times? I think we can. For starters, we can start to spot the warning signs. Though many trying times are brought on by sudden tragedy or circumstance, plenty of them are not. We can monitor our emotions, give ourselves permission to feel them, and notice when we begin to shift or slide. And we can sound the alarm then to a trusted friend, partner, family member, and not an alarm to say, stop the train, but instead, please help me ride this As members of a community, we can offer mutual support simply by sharing a favorite novel, a cup of coffee, or a walk around the block. Our winters vary in duration and in severity, but they always come around. So relying on one another in these times is vital. Being of service to someone else can build up our resilience, but also increase the likelihood that we will seek our own support when challenges sprout up and become too much to cast aside. And so this, my friends, is what we must remember. Winter always comes, but so too does springtime and the miracles of birth and rebirth that abound when light returns and growth becomes tangible once more. We can take our lessons from the trees and the deep complexity with which they manage the seasons of growth, rest, and renewal. And we can learn from the psychologists and the poets, but the message is simple. Suffering is inevitable. We are each beautifully and wonderfully made. And rest is not a reward. Rest is not a reward. It is a necessity, a part of being alive. We must give ourselves the grace to see the beauty in that. In our winters, we can find healing, restoration, and reimagination, held in love by our community and ourselves. We will emerge both deeply changed and yet unchanged. Our own perfect mix of starchy and sweet, just as intended. May it be so.